institutions have been facing, as well as international students make up such a huge number of the international body here, or the student body, especially, for example, in Canada, where they make up 1 in 4 of the post-secondary school body. So essentially what we want to do here today is really discuss some of these challenges that these international students have been facing in light of COVID-19, and hopefully how online work integrated learning can help to play a part in improving that experience. So we brought in a few experts today to shed some light on this. We're joined by a couple of experts in the field, one from Canada, Geoff Wilmshurst, and then also Sophie Turnball from the UK. And then we also have Justin Mosbey joining us, who's actually currently an international student here in Canada. But I'll let them sort of take the floor to introduce themselves a little bit more. So maybe Sophie, if you want to get started, just giving a quick little background about yourself.
Yeah, no problem. So hi, and thanks a lot for having me here today. It's really great to be able to talk from my experience. So my name's Sophie Turnball. I'm the head of the international office at the University of West of England in Bristol. I've been in that role for about 3 years. Prior to that, I was regional manager for North America, actually living in Canada. So I've had experience of kind of recruiting to the UK from overseas. I was also regional manager for South Asia for UE, and I worked for a period of time as well for Into, which is a private pathway provider. So I've kind of spanned different regions, different types of education providers, and I'm now kind of overviewing the head of the international office at the university. So hopefully that experience might give a little bit of input to the webinar today, and I should hopefully be able to give you a little bit of insight from my perspective.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sophie. And then I guess I'll move along here to Geoff, if you could be so kind to sort of introduce yourself as well.
Thanks very much, Harris, and I want to thank Ripen for inviting me to join this this panel today. I think it's a really timely topic. My background has some similarities to Sophie's. In fact, I have been in the post-secondary world for quite some time, as well as the international exchange world. I started back in Canada after being in New York for a number of years with AFS, International Student Exchange Organization. Started at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops, British Columbia, which for those of you who may not be familiar with our geography is in the interior, southern interior of British Columbia. And then for a short time, for 3 years, I was the business development director for Study Group in Canada. So similar to Into, a very interesting organization and an interesting pathway program provider. And then about 9 years ago, I joined Camosun College. And Camosun, and where I'm the Vice President of Partnerships. Camosun is the largest college in British Columbia. We have 19,000 students over 2 campuses. Have about 2,000 international students in a good year, and that's not one of those years, unfortunately. And we're a very comprehensive institution. So we offer everything from trades and technology programs through to post-degree diplomas in business. So a very, very wide range, but we are an applied learning school. We're a school of access, so we cater very much to small class sizes and to an applied learning kind of model. We're based on Vancouver Island, and Vancouver Island is an island about the size of Taiwan. We have just under 1 million residents here. The city of Victoria is the capital of British Columbia, where we're located. And we have about 350,000 people. And I'm happy to tell you that in the last few weeks, we've had no new COVID cases. So in fact, we are essentially COVID-free on Vancouver Island. So it's one of the advantages of living on an island, I have to say. But anyway, I'm looking forward to having a broader conversation on the topic. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Geoff. And also good news to hear about Vancouver Island's health standards right now. But on that note, I'll actually pass it over here to Justin, who's based on the other side of Canada, to introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Harris and Daniela. Thank you very much, Ripen, for inviting me to this forum. I'm an international student at Queen's University from Nairobi, Kenya, and also R&D and Innovation Manager at Deploy Software Solution. Prior to that, I was working in Kenya as an information system expert for 10 years. I'm looking forward to to hearing more from the other panelists, and of course, engaging with the participants more. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for introducing yourselves and sort of giving us a little bit of an understanding about where you're coming from. I think what we want to start off today in the topic then, rather than getting into the solutions just yet, let's dive a little bit into some of the challenges that are specifically being faced by international students. So let's talk a little bit about what unique challenges are students facing during this pandemic right now. I'll leave the floor open here.
I'll go. Before the pandemic, many international students were working part-time jobs to earn money for their upkeep and also to pay their school fees. When businesses scaled down, many suffered job losses, and currently there are very few opportunities available. So as we speak, very few of them can pay fees for their tuition, and some of them have loans from their countries. It's quite challenging. Unlike the local students who have government-assisted programs, most of us don't qualify for those programs. And also the borders are closed, we cannot go home.
There are some real issues there. I mean, yeah, we've seen similar things in the UK and at UE. So a lot of students who take advantage of part-time work, especially those doing postgraduate, and often use that to supplement their living costs, have lost a lot of those jobs, especially because our hospitality is closed. Universities themselves, a lot of them have. So at UE, we've got a fund that's been set up to support our international students, but we've had no government intervention, unfortunately. So there's been encouragements from government to universities to support students who are financially impacted, but they've not actually offered any assistance themselves. Thankfully, the borders in the UK, or not thankfully, depending on whose opinion it is, haven't closed. However, we know that a very large number of airports or airlines have scaled down their services. So even though our borders are still open and the airports are still open, there's a very small number of costs. And then what that meant at one point is that students were having to pay thousands of pounds for economy seats to get back home, to the point where actually some students have had to, India have repatriated some of their students back to India to offer support because they've not been able to afford to get there. So I think financial loss has definitely been one of the biggest things, and will be something that we continue to see, both for existing students who perhaps their family's financial situation have changed as a result, and some of our new applicants whose already we're seeing say that they can no longer come because their family businesses have been impacted, and already that loss of income is impacting on their potential to study.
Yeah, and I would add that, many of the same challenges that we're seeing here. I mean, we had a kind of a surprising, and I don't know if it's unique, but certainly surprising result. We had about 2,000 students here when the pandemic was declared in March. And we have managed to reach out and speak to pretty much every one of those students. And what we learned is that 1,500 of our students actually remained in the Vancouver Island, Victoria area, which was a big surprise for us. And that's brought challenges, obviously. As Justin's pointed out, there are very few jobs, and many of our students were relying on part-time work in order to be able to fund their studies and to fund their living costs. And so many of those jobs have dried up, although they seem to be coming back a bit now as we begin to reopen here. The other thing I wanted to highlight is the fact that there are a lot of students who are living on their own and really feeling isolation. And not being able to connect with people. And if you don't have a family connection in the community as many of us do, that makes it even more difficult. And so we've been trying to double up on our counseling services and our ability to reach out to students online or over the phone. And we're also hearing that our students, especially for the fall, are looking at the financial situation, and many of them are going to have to make the decision that they can't afford to come back to school. So it's going to be a challenging time in the next couple of months for sure.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like there's definitely a few sort of similarities between the UK and Canada, obviously. And coming from Justin too, the financial side seems to be a huge concern. And whether that be that students are no longer even able to travel to the country to study, and then obviously if they're even allowed to do that with visa restrictions as well. So definitely a few challenges there. And I know actually, Geoff, you brought up a sort of a good point I want to expand on here a little bit more into the next question. where you mentioned sort of what you're doing at Camosun College in terms of mental health. And I know just in general, right now with some of these challenges students are facing and, trying to get work afterwards or part-time work, or struggling with mental health, how are post-secondary institutions right now reacting to some of these challenges to ensure that international students still feel supported and get value from their experience?
Right. So we at Camosun, we've always had dedicated counseling staff just for international students who are specialists in working with international students. And one of and those services were always quite well used. And there was concern among the counselors that when they were not able to meet face-to-face with students, that students would not reach out to them. But what they found, in fact, is that an awful lot of students actually like the online counseling approach. So texting back and forth, for example, or speaking over the phone for lots of people seems to be actually quite a comfortable way to approach counseling. So that's certainly one of the things that we've really expanded on, and we've seen quite a good uptake in terms of the number of students who've been accessing that. I wanted to add also that and I think this is true of many post-secondary institutions around the world, we created a special fund. In our case, we called it Erasing Barriers. And the community, and that fund is available both to domestic and international students, and the community really stepped up, and we've managed to raise about $400,000 over the last 2 months to be able to provide short-term relief to students who may need money for rent or groceries. So a lot of our international students have been accessing those monies, and I think that's been helping us a lot.
Yeah, and I think we've seen at UE, I mean, very similar. I think mental health has been such a big, universities have had a huge role over the last few years in really stepping up and supporting students, because we know that even pre-COVID, that mental health issues were on the rise, and that a lot of students needed that support, both domestic and international, when coming over. And what we began to see even before the UK lockdown was a lot of our international students very nervous about the kind of UK approach to coronavirus. So if you're from a country where masks are worn almost by standard, where the government had a much firmer approach, we know the difference in perhaps how the approach in China was to the UK, that a lot of students, and especially their parents, I mean, what was very interesting for us, we saw a lot of parent intervention in that early time, which, is understandable, of course, when your child is across the world and the media perception of how things are being handled plays into all of this. But what's been interesting actually is we've seen some of that initial concern from our students who have remained, because similar to Geoff, we've had quite a large number who have stayed in the UK even though the borders have been open, is that actually they're still using those services, they're still reaching out, they're still using their communities and their online networks, but in terms of the UK support, but also those back home. But that actually a lot of the students of the resilience has been incredibly strong, and their kind of ability to connect with others it's been very impressive. And I've spoken to quite a lot of students myself personally who are still at the university and have been very impressed by actually how forward thinking and focused they've been, regardless of everything going on. And actually in some cases I felt I've got something to learn from these students who aren't being necessarily bogged down by what's happening right now, but are still in that really tenacious period of wanting to know, well, what about my internship, what about my job? And there's concern there, but there's some real entrepreneurial approaches that I'm seeing, which I think is really promising and really does actually showcase the kind of strength that a lot of our international students have.
Certainly, that's a really interesting. Even you brought up the thought that some of these international students are actually being quite entrepreneurial and creating ways to still get their job work or get their job placements as well. Because I know obviously that's a huge concern in terms of work permits afterwards as well. So I'm curious on that note, actually, given sort of the shift towards how to actually handle getting these work placements and get these jobs. What are some of the experiences you've seen from students that are quite entrepreneurial, and how do you sort of feel that maybe is how online learning, online tools can potentially facilitate some of those learning experiences for students?
Yeah, I can take this one just quickly. I'm conscious I don't want to take over. So what we've seen, we've got a number of master's programs. So we have two main placement types at the university. We have undergraduate sandwich years, which tend to be year-long placements that are incorporated into the courses. We're still having a lot, they would normally start for our current students in September. And at the moment, we're seeing a real mix of that. Some of those companies are still offering those placements. Some of them are, because some of them are small SMEs, so they perhaps don't have the finance or even the capabilities of supporting those students anymore. So we've seen a lot of those are still really wanting to support the students, but are shifting. But it's been our postgraduate students that have been really interested, because we have a number of programs where they have 1 year taught and 1 year masters. And those are the students that I've been really impressed with, the kind of the ways that they've been approaching it. So some of them are talking about setting up their own companies to actually, you know, and actually almost sponsoring themselves. So we've got some students on our Masters in Information Technology from India, who are actually, between 3 of them, looking at setting up their own business to look at some software development and some app development. Now, unfortunately, in the UK, they can't do that because of the visa. So, you know, there are barriers to this still for the students, but they are really looking, a lot of them are looking at voluntary options. A lot of companies are, you know, entrepreneurial as well and are moving towards online. So a lot of them are moving to more those virtual placements. So very similar to what Ripen's beginning to see, is a lot of students now are being very open to the kind of placement and not just looking at that physical. And I think, you know, I'm sure for all of us here, that you realise when you're working from home that a lot can be achieved virtually, and actually there's going to be a real shift, I think, out of this in the way that people operate, and the students being part of this perhaps will be some of the quickest to react to that.
Certainly, yeah, it's quite interesting how you're saying that the students are sort of driving some of this change, it sounds like, in the UK as well. Geoff or Justin, have you sort of experienced anything like that as well?
Yeah, most of my classmates are involved with the local communities. They volunteer to offer services for local communities, for local businesses that have been hit by the pandemic. And also some of them have started businesses. So we get to do virtual mock-ups, virtual ideation, just to give them ideas on how to come up with businesses during this. So my classmates have been really engaged. For me, I work with the place software. So what I've had from my classmates is more engagement with the community. Basically, that's more like it.
You know, I have you know, one example. It's actually my son. I'm an old guy, so I've got children that are almost Justin's age probably. And so my son is in law school, and he was supposed to do his a legal internship over the summer in Toronto. He's based in Dalhousie University in Halifax, and the law firm has in fact switched over the job to one in which he can do it remotely. You know, and I expect that a lot of employers are looking at very similar kinds of options. And, you know, as Sophie's pointed out, students can be very innovative. I know we have lots of our students that have been quite engaged in trying to find really different kinds of work opportunities. One of the things that, because we are a trade school in part, one of the things that we've been able to do, for example, is to design and manufacture personal protection equipment at Camosun. And so a number of our students have been involved in that project. We've been producing face shields for our local hospitals. And students have gotten real hands-on experience in what it means to use some of the equipment and the design machines in order to do that. So we've been trying to take advantage of the fact that we are an applied institution with equipment, and to get our students involved in some of that work.
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating how it's, as you mentioned, you know, you're actually able to use some of the equipment that you actually have to help out in this situation too. But I think something that also seemed to come up as a trend in a couple of your answers there were about sort of the community and the volunteering and helping out with businesses as well. How have you found that international students have been able to sort of take advantage of the online tools to still be a part of the community, whether it be through work or personal engagements?
I think at UE, what we've seen, so what we've really tried to facilitate across the university, I mean, initially, I think a lot because of the concerns around the mental health, is setting up those global or virtual communities. And we've seen real kind of increased take up from that. So some of it is very simple. Some of it is our local community. So it's the UE community, and maybe even right down to the international community, or maybe it could be part of one of our student societies or groups. But students really beginning to reach out. And actually our student union, I mean, the student unions in the UK play a huge part of supporting our both domestic and international students. So they've been doing a huge amount in putting things in place to ensure that students are connected throughout this time. So we've seen kind of a lot done by parts of the university. We've seen a lot done by the students themselves to ensure that they're still reaching out, that they're kind of looking, you know, the wider community from Bristol, apart from that, is probably a little harder for me to comment on, because I don't get involved in that side of things as much, but I can see from across the university a lot of really good practice. And actually what we are beginning to do now, and I think, you know, I'm sure again, like a lot of universities, we're picking up practice now that we would know that we will keep in place much longer. So we've always done work trying to connect our current students with our prospective students, but what we're seeing now is because everyone's moved to online and everyone's virtual and there are these communities forming, it's been much easier to connect the kind of existing with the potential new, and that's had great success, students being able to connect. And so over the next few months ahead of our intake, that's something that we will focus on much more.
Yeah, and I can add that at Camosun, our Cooperative Education department has been working really closely with our international students who've always been very engaged in wanting to have work and internship experiences. And I know that there's a lot of work being done here to see how that how some of that work can be engaged more remotely. And so we're doing our best on that front.
Absolutely there. Yeah, no, there's both great points on all fronts there. And actually, I'm sort of curious, sort of going from that a little bit more into sort of the importance of some of these experiential opportunities that are being had. And I know, Justin, you've had a little bit of experience this yourself, but I was wondering if we can shift the conversation a little bit more towards now the role that experiential education and work integrated learning can really have in the journey of an international student, and then potentially how this can be then shifted into an online model.
Experiential education is very important. It allows students to put into practice concepts and framework that they've learned in real world concepts. It also helps to develop confidence, build their competence and skills. It also gives us the exposure to learn the Canadian work culture, and requires us to reflect upon learning how our skills learned through academic studies can be employed through beyond classrooms. So it helps us build competency skills and transition into the Canadian job graduation. As I had mentioned to you earlier, Harris, that if you apply for, let's say, work here in Canada, nobody will know if you're in Canada or you're in Kenya. For my case, for instance, all my experiences I have are from Kenya. And if HR officer gets hold of my CV, they'll not know if I'm in Canada or Kenya. So getting experiential learning by working with a Canadian company is really key and very important. It also helps us build on past knowledge and experiences, and gives us a meaningful active construction, collaboration, and exchange of ideas.
And on that note, actually, Justin, I'm curious because I think with your experiences, you did do some of your placements online as well, I believe.
Yep.
How did you find that it affected your experience at all, or if you found that to even be a challenge at all?
Most of my work I did online during my project, and up to now I'm still doing online. So I didn't experience any kind of challenge. But the good thing is that it helped me acquire some of the soft skills, teamwork, decision making, like critical thinking, which comes a long way, especially when applying for work in the Canadian market. And also,
I think, sorry, Justin. I just wanted to say that, you know, I think you're an example of somebody who's a little bit older and experienced, and I'm really glad that's working for you. I am concerned, though, in the long run. I'm hoping we're going to get out of this COVID situation in sometime in the next 12 months, because I think for a lot of, you know, 18-year-old students who are graduating high school, and I'm talking international students now, and this would apply to our local students as well, that they're going to struggle in an online environment, in my opinion, both in studies and in work environments. We, you know, at the end of the day, we need to all get back to, there has to be some face-to-face interaction between people. And I completely agree with you that it's that applied experiential learning that's so valuable. And it's certainly what we focus on here at Camosun, and we know is really important. And so while we can, there's certainly opportunities coming out of the COVID world that we're in, with people learning to sort of function in an online environment. I hope we're not going to be here for a whole lot longer, because I think that we do need to get back together and actually have face-to-face interactions. Certainly, we look at our trades area, for example, we will start bringing our trade students back on campus in the next couple of months. And that's because you can't learn to be a pipe fitter or a welder unless you actually do those things and you actually hold the equipment. So, you know, I think for some people, this has been a good experience. They're able to function quite well, but for others, I think it's quite difficult.
It's definitely good to be aware of the challenges, I guess, too, and that, as you said, it depends on the industry that you're in as well. Something like a plumbing might be more challenging to get hands-on done online. But I know, for example, Justin working in, I guess, more analytics and software, you see a lot of different sort of opportunities to engage there. And I guess maybe, I'm not sure yourself, Sophie, if you sort of have had any experience with this in the UK.
Yeah, so we, the UK, I suppose, up until recently has still been quite traditional, although it will vary from institution to institution, but a lot of placements and internships have been face-to-face, because I think, you know, it's very easy to get into that kind of role of tradition. And even though we can see that digital has been, well, not just creeping up on us, but has kind of hit us in the face over the last few years, I think universities have still been a little bit slow to perhaps adopt the digital age, perhaps much slower than a lot of our young students are actually. And what I think has been quite interested, even if you look at the academic side of things, you know, you, Ian, I'm sure similar to a lot of the universities that have joined us here today, have been talking about online, both in terms of teaching and placements for quite a number of years, and it's been lots of conversations and lots of meetings and lots of, oh well, we could do this or we couldn't. And I think what the pandemic has shown, that these things can be done, and actually when they are done, there's some real wins that you get out of them. So what we've seen, I mean, almost certainly what we see in terms of students wants in terms of teaching is we're seeing much more of an appetite for face-to-face or them getting back on campus. So we can see almost certainly that there's a lot of online learning fatigue. But what we're beginning to see with our internships is quite interesting, is that where we've had some smaller placements and we've shifted to getting those internships, that students actually have, I suppose, very much like Justin's situation, they have been quite open to that. And I wonder, and I agree with Geoff, I think, you know, we want to go back to face-to-face for many, many different reasons. But I do think there's a real place for us, even if we were to return to the normal, not even the new normal, but even if in a year's time we were to go back to where we were pre-March, I still think there's a real place there for this. And I think that's because we are in a digital world. And often when I speak to students who are very focused just on a destination, I will often say to them that I really feel that you're cutting off a lot of opportunity if you only focus on just wanting to be in Canada or just wanting to be in the UK or just wanting to be in the US. I understand all the reasons for that you're really limiting themselves. And I think the opportunities for digital and online give that really nice flexibility of students being able to still learn in countries where they see that the education system is something they want to aspire to, perhaps the job market is something, but that by having those global internships, they're not limiting themselves just by a destination. So I think there's a real opportunity there to kind of merge the two a lot more going forward, or that's what I would hope.
Absolutely. It's definitely a good approach, and thinking that it can, by being online, it can open up more opportunities to people to see or interact with people in different cultures that they wouldn't necessarily have had the opportunity to travel to. Definitely. And before, before moving on there a little bit, I do want to dig a little bit more into that, and also with Justin's experience as well, because you mentioned, I think, Sophie, about the, going to a country for a specific work, sort of work opportunities afterwards. And that is obviously a big part of this. So I know some countries have been adapting how they handle work permits for international students as well, based with online learning now being included in that. Have either you, Geoff, or Sophie, wanted to touch on that?
Geoff, do you want to go first? I mean, I can definitely talk about the UK, but there's probably a bit more positive news. Yeah, there's probably a bit more positivity out of Canada at the moment.
There are certainly opportunities out there, and I'm also noticing some of the questions online, and I know we're going to have an opportunity to engage with the folks who are online with us today. I think that we are getting to a stage here in British Columbia where we're certainly going to be able to reopen much more quickly. We're in what's called phase 2 right now. They're actually planning to move us to phase 3 in the next few weeks if everything stays calm in terms of COVID. And so I certainly see an opportunity for students here locally to be able to kind of re-engage in the internship world, and to be able to get back to doing some of the experiential things that they've been wanting to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the UK, so we had the government announce just September gone that they're reintroducing our post-study work visas. So unlike Canada, we've been a bit mean to our international students. It's been very hard for them to remain in the UK and get work after graduation. So that will be back in for students who graduate from September 2021. And there's a lot of discussion at the moment, and a lot of lobbying from UK universities who are saying that if international students are having to study quite a large percentage potentially of their studies online this year, will that impact on their future working rights in the UK? And so we've not had an update on that, but we're very conscious that we don't want the current situation to negatively impact on students, especially with their post-study work opportunities. But I think it's, a lot of universities have been quite cautious, and they're continuing. I know at UE that we're in discussions with Ripen about engaging with the internships and the online platforms, and we were in discussions. I've had discussions with Ripen even previous to the pandemic, because you can really see where those opportunities come. So I think there's a space there still, and I think there will be a real, we've seen with our current international students, and that they're really, their main goal, if possible, is they would love to stay in the UK and get that work experience. However, they really do, want a good, relevant work experience. And for a lot of them, if that comes in the form of a digital placements, they are happy and open to consider that. But for them, I think the sweet spot is something that enables them to stay in the UK and explore their work opportunities for a few years. But if that comes to them digitally, and it's a relevant and strong placement, that is more preferable than them going and working in a McDonald's or something like that post-graduation, because that's when you really begin to dilute that educational offering for them.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's good to keep a focus on, I guess, the skills that they're gaining from these placements as well. And then it'll be interesting. Now we'll wrap up and get to the questions here shortly, but it'll be interesting seeing how the UK adapts to that. Whereas I know in Canada, for example, with postgraduate work permits afterwards, online learning has now been allowed to be involved in that. So it's interesting seeing how even the government adapts to this as well. But on that note, I do know that we, as I think Geoff mentioned, we do have a few questions coming in our chat box here as well. So I do want to open the floor a little bit here so that we can engage a little bit with our viewers right now and sort of hear some of their perspectives. So we'll be starting to field a couple of these questions here. Danny, if you want to choose the first ones to go through here.
Yeah, for sure. So just to start off, one of the first questions we had was, do you know any employers who are still open to giving international students internships, even though the students remain abroad? And is this an issue for employers' tax purposes? So I imagine, Geoff and Sophie, the answer may be different for the two of you, but go ahead.
Well, maybe I'll start by saying that I'm really not all that familiar with which Canadian employers are offering those kinds of opportunities. And I certainly don't know what the tax implications of those might be. But like I said, I mentioned my son's instance, and so I don't want to generalize, obviously, but there obviously are some companies that are looking at these opportunities for students, and there's certainly a recognition that students generally, and international students in particular, really are going to need those kinds of work opportunities and internships in order to be able to progress.
Yeah, and I think in the UK, I mean, again, taxation is not an area that I can even pertain to tend to know anything about. However, actually, if they're looking for a placement in the UK, that their taxation, I do know in the UK it would be very similar to, their taxpayers in the same way that anyone would be, and therefore companies have the same tax kind of liabilities as they would do anywhere. Outside of that, I'm assuming what most of our students are looking for, I suppose, is if they're looking at an overseas placement, quite often it's back in their own country. So for example, the visa in the UK, the visa that they study on for the duration of their study, if they manage to get an overseas placement, that visa remains throughout. So students don't lose that visa, and they can go. So for example, some of our Indian students are now looking at placements back in India, because actually quite often for them that's the easiest, especially at a time like this. They quite often will have especially in India, a lot of them will have family businesses or friends who have family businesses who are happy to support their placements. So again, taxation would be, I assume, whatever it would be in terms of employing an Indian citizen, and their tier 4 visa remains. So that's a really nice balance for them, because they don't lose that kind of visa strength that they get, and therefore the post-study work visa going forward, but they get that security and all that comes with it in terms of taxation and things like that. I think the problem that we're seeing at the moment is this is a global pandemic, so there's not many, I mean, maybe we'll all go to Vancouver Island and get jobs there in the coming months, but there's not many countries at the moment who unfortunately aren't seeing what we're all seeing, which is potential redundancies, closure of places. So because it is such a global thing, I think it's so hard to say which countries are likely to give those placements, because we're all going through very similar things. I think it will only be in the next 3, 6 months, a year, 2 years, where we will begin to start to see a bit of light in terms of where hasn't been as badly hit. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Justin, I'm wondering as well if you have anything to add, and I'll ask this follow-up question too. But the panel, the attendees are wondering what you've seen or heard from international students that have returned to their countries. What are they doing successfully when taking online courses and or looking for volunteer work? I think this individual is looking for some ideas of what tips they might share with students for those students who have returned home.
Frankly speaking, most of my classmates are still around here. I'm yet to know any of these international students who have gone home. So I'm not in a good position, to advise on the tips on what those who have gone home are doing.
Maybe I can comment on it. We've actually had not a huge number, but certainly upwards of 100 students who have engaged in our spring and summer programs who are overseas. So these are mainly students of ours who returned home. And the feedback we've received so far has been pretty good, actually, that they've been able to engage on our D2L site and have been finding the study experience pretty good. So we've been trying to keep in touch with that and with our students and how their experience has been. We have had, and I saw in one of the questions about referring to India and China, I think we've had more success with our students in India than we've had with our students in China, and that's in China due to some extent to the firewall situation, to the internet firewall, which has made it very difficult for many of our Chinese students to connect to our online offerings.
I think at UWE we're quite lucky. So when the government very kindly removed the post-work visa back in 2012, we were quite quick to react. And it sounds like I'm digressing, and I am slightly, but this has got a relevant point. So off the back of that, we recognised that international students would still want to come to the UK, but that it would be very likely that they would have to return home. So what we did is we got some funding to look at the perception in Malaysia of Malaysian students who have studied in the UK and then returned to Malaysia for work. And actually it was very successful. So what we began to do was engage with companies, mainly for postgraduate, for graduate work, so not so much for internships, who actually valued a student who'd gone abroad for an international education. From that, we expanded it. So we now have GradLink China, GradLink India, Canada, Eastern Europe, Africa, MENA, and ASEAN as well. So these are, you know, for us actually, we're quite aware actually of companies, and you know, it was quite interesting. I was part of the GradLink India trip, and we visited a lot of companies who really were really understood, you know, what the power of an international degree meant for an Indian student, and saw the differences to them. But we also went to some companies who said very clearly, we are not interested in hiring an Indian student who has gone to the UK. And it was quite funny. So one of them, and I won't name and shame, but said because they won't do what they're told and they expect more money. So we don't want them, because we want students who only do what they do told, don't question us, don't, you know, don't go outside of the norm, which is not what the kind of students we're producing. So at UWE, because we have this resource, and it's a nationwide resource actually around the UK, there's been quite a lot of work done to understand from those countries. So when we're talking to students, we can quite often refer them to this resource. And these are, you know, big companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers on there, right down to small SMEs who really do value that kind of student. So when we kind of are pointing students in the direction of internships and things, quite often we will talk to them about these kind of companies, because we know they're proactively looking for UK educated nationals, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing those insights. There's a question, Justin, here for you. I think you saw it, but the question for everyone is, Justin, in your experience taking online courses, do you prefer live sessions totally online or a bit of a hybrid?
I prefer hybrid. First of all, online sessions gives you flexibility, and the hybrid, because you get to interact with this wealth of intellectual community, which is very important, and also networking, which is very important here in Canada. So I prefer a hybrid method.
Awesome. And I know we're coming up on time, so I wanted to ask, actually this is a great question, and then we can wrap up after this one, but to all of the panelists, what do you recommend international students to make, what do you recommend to international students to make their LinkedIn profile stand up during this time and going forward? So I don't know, Sophie, it looks like you've got some suggestions.
Yeah, we do quite a lot of work actually at UWE with our international students around their LinkedIn profiles. So we actually start quite early. So we do a lot of work in high schools where we go in and start to speak to them about building up their profile then. So it's not just something that's sparse and kind of hastily created, you know, in the run up to them needing to get work. So they've actually got a good, strong connection there. So what we often talk to them about is really utilising those connections. I think it's very easy, and I'm guilty of this on LinkedIn, in connecting with a lot of people, with having thousands of connections, but not necessarily doing anything with those. So we really talk to them about how they should engage smartly with those connections. So not just by spamming them, but really using it both as a research tool. So, you know, really kind of using it to research thoroughly what they're doing, and then making sure that they're updating their profile to kind of really represent the kind of roles they're going to. And I mean, to be honest, I'm probably not going to give anything, you know, as a resounding example of what we're saying students should be doing in the pandemic, but really this is such a key time for them to be using something like LinkedIn and really making advantage of, because everyone is at home and everything is virtual, and people are a lot more open to making those connections now, but also being smart about it and not spamming people with a virtual CV, which is just a copy and paste letter or email from everything. So in the same way, applying for jobs, be smart and do that research. And actually LinkedIn gives you that as a platform more than any job application would do.
Yeah, I want to add to that. I get a lot of LinkedIn requests, and I've become a little more discerning about it lately, just because some of them are don't seem all that legitimate. But once in a while, I get requests from what are clearly students, and if they follow up with me in a really genuine way, I'll absolutely respond to that. And I do get those kinds of follow-ups where they'd like to have a chat with me. And I know I certainly reach out to young people when I can to have those conversations. And I know a lot of my colleagues feel the same way, that if they get a genuine outreach from someone to talk to them about career possibilities or internship possibilities, I know that I'm open to that, and lots of other people are open to that.
I'd like to add on that, that you should constantly update your LinkedIn to be up to date. All the courses that you take, make sure you update it so that can look neat, because that's the first place an employer goes to when you make your application. And also, it's through LinkedIn where you have coffee chats or you request for coffee chats. So it's basically your dashboard. Make sure it's updated and very neat.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are good tips, some of which I should take myself. So I wanted to just start wrapping up here. Thank you all so much for joining and for sharing your expertise with us and with our attendees today. I definitely learned some new things. I think as we all continue to adapt to an online learning environment, it's valuable to hear from everyone's experiences and preferences. So thank you to everybody who attended, and to you, Sophie, Geoff, and Justin, for making the time to join us and educate us today.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having us.
No
Thank
problem.
you very much.
Have a wonderful weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.